Everyone thinks World War I was a total waste of time, or as far as wars go, it was pretty meaningless. For example, if the Axis powers had won, would anyone remember that a German guy was Kaiser of Austria-Hungary at the end? I mean, I wouldn't. But the First World War is definitely worth learning about because everything that came later grew directly out of it. So let's see what it was actually like. It's September 3rd, 1914, and you are on a beach in Flanders, Belgium. You hear the sound of an approaching train, bang, bang, bang. You look over your shoulder and watch as the last carriage flies past you. And on the roof, you see men waving white flags. Now you're confused. Were they surrendering? Wait a second. Those are white helmets, as in Pickelhaube. Those are German helmets. You run onto the tracks and try to flag down the train, but it pulls away, leaving you covered in coal dust and several inches of mud. On the beach behind you, several hundred yards away, some guys dressed in odd hats are desperately running away. Others stand around frozen in fear. Only a couple of empty sand dunes lie between you and the sea. And just beyond that, the German soldiers are debarking on the beach itself. Not to worry, though, because a Belgian officer has already organized the defense. His plan is pretty simple. 200 men will defend a half-mile stretch of coastline. They all set up 2 swivel guns on the beach and wait for the Germans to come to them. Now you're probably asking yourself, how did the Belgians lose this battle? Well, it's partly because the Belgians are very numerous and their forces are divided up all over the country. But also, the real reason is that this battle isn't really happening, because there is no real Battle of Belgium. Even though it was clear that the only way to surround Paris was to go through Belgium, nobody thought the Germans would actually do it. And as a result, the Belgians barely resisted at all. Most of their troops were spread out along the eastern border with Germany, and they weren't even expecting the Germans to come through Belgium. So the few divisions stationed near the coast were either caught off guard or were busy dealing with German spies. Even as the German army poured through Belgium, the Belgian government continued to believe that they would be routed and captured by German cavalry. So most of their troops were kept in reserve, holding their positions until the inevitable German cavalry came thundering toward them. In reality, when the Germans arrived, there was almost no resistance, except for a small village where 300 Belgians held off 800 Germans for 3 hours. That battle was the most intense fighting Belgium saw throughout the entire war. The Germans weren't exactly gentle with the Belgians. On their way to France, they looted villages, burned farms, and murdered people. And on August 25th, they committed the Antwerp massacre. On that day, German troops executed around 200 people in the town of Antwerp. The victims were political leaders, police officers, customs officials, tax collectors, and even priests. The Germans felt that the Belgians were getting in their way, that they needed to be punished, and that killing high-ranking civilians would discourage the rest of the Belgians from resisting. But as the Germans advanced toward France, it became clear that they had made a mistake. It took them 5 days to get through Belgium. This meant that, instead of being able to attack France with all their forces at once, they had to do it in dribs and drabs, giving the French time to mobilize their defenses. France was prepared for war, unlike Belgium, because everyone thought it was going to happen. But now that the Germans were in the open fields of France, the French defenders had the advantage. The Germans had to find new ways to keep advancing. So they deployed giant guns called Big Berthas to bombard the French fortifications, then sent infantry to capture the forts as they fell. While the Germans bombarded the fortresses, other German forces swung wide to the east, trying to cut off any reinforcements sent to the forts. The German leader, the Schlieffen Plan, hoped that this maneuver would allow them to quickly outflank the Maginot Line and trap the French army in the northeast, but it didn't quite work out that way. As the Germans fought their way forward, the French rearmed and dug into the ground. With little success, the Germans pushed on to within 10 miles of Paris, and then they stopped. The French couldn't defend the city itself, so they fell back into Paris and waited for the Germans to come to them. From the air, the German troops look like ants swarming around the French army. The Germans are 600,000 strong, but only 120,000 are engaged. Still, even though the Germans vastly outnumbered the French, they can't break through the French lines. Both sides prepare for a siege. The Germans know they can't win without capturing Paris, so they start looking for another way in. After a month of trying, they succeed in breaching the outer line of French defenses, and they pour into the city. The French government flees east, followed by the Germans. The French escape to Tours, and the Germans settle in for another round of trench warfare. The Germans have realized that winning a decisive victory will be difficult, especially with Russia joining the fray. The Russian army is massive, with more men than the rest of Europe combined. If the Germans can hold the French in place and avoid losing valuable soldiers, they can just ignore the Russians and finish off the French. But the Russians don't stay out of the war for long. The Russians are hungry to show the world how powerful they are. But here's the thing. Russia isn't particularly organized. Their troops are undertrained. They lack proper supplies, and their generals are incompetent. But the Germans know this, and they're still afraid of the Russian size. So they want to get rid of them anyway. The German plan is to kick the Russian army around until it retreats. At this point, the Germans will pull back to France and finish off the rest of the Russian army. But the Russian offensive is starting fast and furious, which gives the Germans an idea. They'll make a fighting retreat. As they fall back, they'll engage the Russians in battle, weakening them and pushing them further from their supply bases. It's risky, but it seems to be working. The Russians aren't being as effective as the Germans had hoped, but they are taking heavy losses. Then something terrible happens for the Germans. The weather turns cold. The troops are freezing. They're exhausted. They haven't eaten. The Russian army is falling apart. And the Germans don't have enough supplies to finish them off. The Russians are still dangerous. If the Germans hang around much longer, they might get stabbed in the back. So the Germans pull back and race for the safety of their own borders. The fighting continues. Another year passes, and the front lines haven't moved an inch. The generals finally realize that attacking just means sending your soldiers to die. So now both sides spend their time training soldiers and developing weapons that will hopefully give them the edge. By 1917, the war is stuck in a stalemate. The Germans need something to give them the upper hand, like, I don't know, tanks or poison gas. But both sides are developing new technologies to overcome the stalemate. The Americans are also joining the fray, but neither side seems willing to risk an attack. The soldiers in the trenches are weary and no one wants to replace them. Finally, the Russians collapse from within. The Germans take advantage of this and begin pushing west. They're confident that the Russians will hold and the French are exhausted. The Germans push hard and fast, racing toward the sea. They re-close to breaking through the French lines when suddenly they receive orders to stop and consolidate their gains. The Germans aren't sure what's going on, but they're willing to bet it's not good. And they're right, because on November 11th, 1918, the Germans sign an armistice with the Allies, ending their involvement in the war. The Great War is over, but no one is celebrating. The soldiers return home traumatized by what they have seen, and no one knows what the future will bring. Over the next 20 years, tensions rise again, and then the unthinkable happens. It happens again.